شو فايدتنا كأهل بس مش قادرين نحمي أولاد.
No one ever thought any of this would happen.
One of the main things that stood out to me was the exploration of generational trauma. And it feels like it's a theme that is hitting right now, and even a lot of other Oscar contenders as well. So I'm so curious to get your opinion. You know, what is it, do you think, about just where we're at in the world that people are saying, hey, I am open to watching something that is going to kind of cause me to reflect on my own life or reflect on my own worldview, and how a lot of that is from generations past and what my ancestors have gone through?
It's such a good question. It's interesting because I feel like trauma has really been in the zeitgeist. It's like this buzzword that everyone's using. People are talking about their trauma, which is great, like kind of talking openly about sort of personal trauma, community trauma, ancestral trauma. So there's, all these different sort of kinds of traumas. But I think that, given where we are in the world and everything that's happening, and certainly in the Arab world where I come from, it's hard not to talk about the trauma that has been created over time, and certainly within the last 2 years, the kind of ongoing trauma. There's a kind of trauma that people have been talking about in Gaza, which is like not post-traumatic stress, but it's actually present traumatic stress syndrome because it's ongoing. And I think that with this film, I wanted to really explore the question of whether it is possible to heal ongoing trauma, whether present ongoing, traumatic stress is whether it's possible to heal. And can we look at that? Can we at least have a conversation about that?
And I'm curious for you, now that you're kind of on the other side of this now, on the press tour for this film, does it feel like you've kind of found that healing and found that space a little bit? Or is it something that's more ongoing given the circumstances?
I think it's ongoing given the circumstances. When I started writing this, when I started thinking about this film, it was in 2014. So it was many, many years ago. I started writing it in 2020. So I had a long period of gestation and just really, reading a lot of books, immersing myself in different periods of Palestinian history, thinking about the film and coming up with the story and the structure and developing the characters all before I ever started writing. And it wasn't until we were filming that, October of 2023 took place and events escalated very, very quickly. And so, I think talk of trauma has become so ever more present. And I think that I'm so in the eye of the storm right now in terms of just like, I'm still working so hard on this film. First there was the writing of it, and then the making of it, which was very complicated by events because we were supposed to shoot the entire thing in Palestine. We prepped the whole thing there, and then, we were 2 weeks away from shooting when we were forced to evacuate and, flee. So the film lived its own trauma, and the making of, kind of really, there were a lot of traumatic events surrounding the making of. And now I'm getting it out into the world, and so I feel like I'm not really going to know where I land until, I have a little bit more distance from everything that's happening. But, with the current events, I think it's also kind of challenging to get that distance.
Yeah, and talk to me, about having to, I know you prepped the film, were ready to shoot in Palestine, everything happened, had to then pivot to Jordan and Greece and Cyprus, but how did it feel to kind of say, oh man, I have to revisit everything and do it again, but I believe in this film enough to know that it's worth doing the prep again and it's worth making sure that the story's told?
Yeah, well, it's so interesting. I think that when we first fled, I was just in a state of shock and denial. We had worked so hard for 5 months, my crew, my foreign crew, and my Palestinian crew on the ground. We were based in the West Bank, but we were planning to shoot all over the country. And so when we first fled, I was kind of in a state of denial. But I had to kind of quickly realize what was happening and make very fast decisions. And I think that what became really clear was that what we were making had suddenly become so much more relevant and so much more vital. And so everyone just felt really strongly like, we need to get this movie out now. So the sense of urgency, I think, really just increased to the point where, not making the film or even pausing was not an option. Like, we all just this sense of, we had such a strong sense of drive, like, we have to do this. I would say pivoting and starting over was tremendously challenging, and I would say just so emotionally and physically draining, because we had, it was 5 long months of prepping in occupied territory, which already had so many challenges. We had been stopped at checkpoints myriad times. We had been interrogated in the Tel Aviv airport many times. So we were physically exhausted and then had to start from scratch. And I think one of the hardest things about it was that we found ourselves making a movie about what was happening as it was happening. And, watching this genocide unfold and an even larger Nakba unfold as we're making a movie about the original Nakba and the ongoing Nakba. So it was quite emotionally intense. But at the same time, the movie became a container for all of our feelings, and in that way, it was such a gift to have it, to kind of pour ourselves into it. And like really just all of our love, all of our compassion, all of our grief went into this film. And so in some ways, I think the movie is, just has more emotional depth and resonance as a result of what we went through. I mean, it was sort of like it really felt like art and life merging. Some days we were shooting scenes from 1948 and, like Palestinians fleeing their villages, and then suddenly we're seeing very similar scenes come across our social media feeds out of Gaza. And it was really surreal. Just so many surreal moments like that. We're creating these scenes that are just happening right now and unfolding in real time. And I think, in some ways, I'm so grateful for the timing of this, like to have this film at this particular moment it's really, again, it's such a gift, because I don't think you can really understand what's happening today without looking to the past and seeing how it started and when it started, and really what Palestinians have been enduring all of these decades leading up to this. Because what we're seeing today is really an acceleration of what began back then.
Finally reaching the end of production, getting this film out, looking for distributors. I know you got the standing ovation at Sundance, 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, but how did it feel just knowing how upfront this project was? How did it feel to kind of present this to a Hollywood that hasn't been very receptive to Palestinian films?
I went into it really with a lot of hope, thinking we made a universally accessible film about 3 generations of one family attempting to survive decades of political upheaval and personal loss. This is a movie about survival. It's a movie about the love that it takes to overcome tragedy and personal loss, and really anyone can relate to it. So I went into our world premiere with hope that Hollywood distributors would see the potential in the film and would understand the current moment that we're in, the fact that Palestine is on the forefront of people's minds, and people are more interested than ever before in this narrative, in the Palestinian narrative that has really never been told, certainly not with this breadth and this scope, and covering 76 years of history from the point of view of one family. And, I think it's so vitally important that people see this story, like understand this narrative, and that it really, in some ways, is providing, an emotional education. That's what cinema is. It's the language of emotion. And when you're able to tell a story that has been suppressed and erased and, withheld from history books for so long, you're giving people an emotional education of a certain group that has been really dehumanized for going on a century. And sadly, my hopes were dashed, and that sounds very dramatic, but we got to Sundance and we had such a phenomenally warm, emotional, powerful reception to the film, audience-wise, at the festival, and great reviews, and Hollywood distributors passed. And, it's interesting because it really showed me kind of the depths of fear and racism within Hollywood, that, that even despite how accessible we make our films and how interested the world is in our films and how well our films do, because no other land won an Oscar, did very well at the box office, still didn't get picked up, that, you know, that distributors will still shy away from our stories, and we're just not, you know, maybe that will change one day, but that's still where we're at. So it was tremendously disappointing in that moment, you know, and since then I've just found different ways to empower myself as an artist, as a new distributor, you know, who has partnered with, you know, the Watermelon Pictures, another new distributor, but who's been around for a couple of years now and who's doing a really great job of releasing these films. I just rolled my sleeves up and I said, okay, the future of distribution is going to be in the hands of the artists. It has to be. I think that's where we're headed. And I feel really excited now to kind of be at the forefront of that and to really kind of work to create community and to build audience for these kinds of films.
What does that look like to, you know, have your own distribution company, but then also be working with a company like Watermelon Pictures and saying, we're going to get these stories told regardless and make sure that people see reality and see real history?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it feels tremendously empowering. Like, I feel really grateful for it now, because I think that even looking back at my career, I'd always handed my film over, just kind of hoping for the best. I've never really been that involved in distribution. It was always a bit of a mystery to me. And so to really be able to demystify it, to be such an integral part of it, and to sort of start to see distribution as a bit like production, you know, in a way, I'm helping to direct the distribution part of this film now. And so all of the kind of creativity and out-of-box thinking that I brought to production, I can now bring to another part of the process. Is exciting, you know, and I do really feel like that's where we're heading. I think it's tremendously empowering to us, the filmmakers, to be at the forefront of that part of the process. And it's taught me a lot about filmmaking in general and how I can be thinking about marketing and distribution as early as writing, as early as the writing phase of filmmaking.
You know, it is a constant story that we'd hear in the past with a lot of just BIPOC or MENA creatives. It's like, oh, I got this funding, I'm a part of this network or this streaming service. Oh, but it wasn't marketed well, so 5 people in my family members saw it.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we've been so pigeonholed, even ghettoized, I would say, from a marketing point of view. I don't think that distributors in the past have really wanted to, quote, take a risk on our films. I don't think that they believe that there are audiences for them, and I think they're wrong. So I'm actually very excited to prove that, because I really think, especially now, people are really hungry for these stories. And we're already seeing that. We're really, you know, I think no other land proved that very well. But, you know, some of the Palestinian films that are coming out this year, including mine, have already been released in other territories and have performed very well at the box office. So I think that it's we're seeing some exciting change happen.
كتبوا له روشتة لدواء جديد لازم اروح اجيبه.
ان شاء الله خير. سلامتك عمي.
الله يسلمك.
مش في منعت تجول كمان نص ساعة؟
لا لغوه.
الحمد لله.
بابا انا عارف بتأكد انك نفسك تاخذني معك ونشتري تربوزة مشانك. انا موافق اجي معك.
موافق تيجي.
موافق عشانك.
عشاني.
والله.
And I want to go back just to the film, because I loved that not only was this like a very matriarchal story with the mother, but it was also a beautiful story about the bond between a father and his children, and through these generations. And so I'm so curious for you, knowing that you made this a personal story, you implemented stories from your own childhood. What did it mean to you to kind of explore that relationship through the characters?
You know, it was actually really beautiful to explore things that I hadn't spent that much time thinking about. You know, what inspired me to make the film was really my relationship with my dad, and kind of watching the different generations of my own family, from my grandfather to my father to me, and how our identities like kind of formed in opposition to each other. You know, my grandfather was always very calm, you know, he seemed very peaceful. My father was exiled from Palestine and separated from his family in 1967, and it took him years to get foreign citizenship just to return to visit them and to visit his homeland. So he had a lot of heartache and pain around that. And of course, I inherited that, and that's part of what inspired this film. But I think another part of it was kind of watching him grow more and more disillusioned over the years, and even angrier and angrier at, you know, kind of everything happening at home for him, you know, the sort of deterioration of his homeland and the increasing violence, the increasing injustice. And I saw his health suffer as a result of that anger and that chronic stress. And I remember thinking, you know, I don't want that to happen to me. Like, I don't want to, you know, there's got to be a different way. There's got to be another way to respond to the situation. There's got to be something that I can do even from afar, you know, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to become a filmmaker and to tell these authentic stories and like really represent. And so I wanted to really explore that intergenerational trauma in the film. And it was actually a very beautiful, I think, process for me personally, like looking at my own trauma through these characters. And one of the things I really learned is that my trauma is the trauma of so many people, and not just Palestinians, actually. Like, there are so many people who have said to me that they can recognize their own parents or their own grandparents in the characters, that they also grew up in multiple generations, you know, with multiple generations in the same home, and that there are very similar dynamics between the different generations, and they can recognize how identities formed in relationship or in opposition to each other. You know, like me seeing my father grow angrier and his health suffer, and therefore wanting to kind of figure out how I can channel my anger into action and do something constructive with it and really see, is that possible? And in some ways, I gave my characters that same task within the film by introducing this kind of moral dilemma and seeing if they would be able to and willing to try to find meaning in their suffering. You know, I think that ultimately that's what I was really looking to do in the film, because that's what I've been looking to do in my own life, is really ask that question and see how that's possible.
Yeah. Oh, that's really beautiful, just that personal exploration. Has your family been able to watch the film already?
Everyone in my family has seen it except for my dad. Oh, wow. Yes, he has yet to watch it.
He's holding off, or? I'm
holding off. I really want him to see it with an audience. So when the time is right, he will definitely watch it with an audience so that you'll feel the embrace of people, because I think it will be an emotional experience.
My goodness. Oh, that'll be beautiful. If you can, you should record him just for your own memories. Like, not even for the public, just for your own memories, because that's so beautiful to see. And you also sandwiched the film with this really beautiful poem from beginning and then at the end with the parents. Talk to me about the importance and the significance of including that poem and what it meant to the story.
Well, I really wanted to include poetry in the film. It was really important to me because the arts, poetry, literature, film have always been such an important part of Palestinian culture from as far back as, 1948, and obviously way longer ago than that. But the film opens in 1948, and I wanted to show this really cultured upper middle class family. This is a side of Palestine and Palestinian culture we don't get to see very often. I don't know that we've ever seen urban Palestine in 1948 in cinema. And I wanted to show how cultured and educated people were. And, the dress was very cosmopolitan and the homes were so beautiful. And the home that's in the film is specifically designed, the way that the homes in Jaffa and on the Mediterranean were designed with the kind of 3 arches inside and outside. And so I wanted to really kind of have those authentic details. And the poetry was really a part of that. It was part of really the cultural aspect of the film and sort of showing that. And this particular poem I found kind of when looking, doing a deep dive into what poetry was really popular in the 1940s in Palestine. And I discovered this particular poet, Hafiz Ibrahim, who is Egyptian. He's known as the poet of the Nile, but also he was known as the poet of the people because he often wrote wrote poetry about everyday people's struggles. And this particular poem was written kind of in honor of the Arabic language. It's a poem it's like the Arabic language is speaking to the reader and talking about the richness of its language, of itself, the richness of its depths. And I loved it so much because it's just really, I think it's about the language, which is also about the culture. And so, but also when you hear it, it could be a poem that is evoking the Palestinian people. It could be evoking you and I, the depths of our own treasures and what's, in our hearts. And so I felt like there were kind of many meanings that one could interpret when hearing it. And so I really loved it, and I wanted to kind of bookend the film with it.
فلا تكلوني للزمان فإنني
أخاف عليكم من
أنت حين وفاتي. طب إذا أنت ذكي قل لي هاي إيش المقصود فيها؟
البحر.
غلط.
هو بقول أنا البحر.
هو بيستخدم البحر كاستعارة.
بلشنا كمان مرة.
هذه صورة
رمزية.
هو بيشبه اللغة العربية بالبحر.
طب هو ليه ما بيحكيها مباشرة؟
لأنه هاد شاعر بينفعش يحكي مباشرة.
You were at the Q&A on Friday. You mentioned how the protest scene was the first one that you had solidified in the script, where you said, "Okay, I'm ready. I have a story here. Let's move forward." Yeah. What was it about that specific scene that really gave you that confidence as a writer in the story that you were trying to tell?
I think that first I lived that experience, right? So it was like really a visceral experience that I got to see with my own eyes, being at a checkpoint, at the entrance of a refugee camp as a protest is forming, and seeing just the kind of the dramatic scene of all of the people marching towards a checkpoint with, tires under their arms and fires lit in the tires to keep the tanks from entering and the military jeeps from entering, and particularly the image of the young men and teenage boys with, rocks in their hands, willing to face down Israeli soldiers with M16s pointed at them. And it was that image that kind of never left my mind because, as a Palestinian who grew up in the diaspora, I grew up surrounded with Western media images like that from the first Intifada, where we saw all the time this image of teenagers, Palestinian men facing down Israeli soldiers, getting in front of, tanks and bulldozers and army jeeps, really willing to put themselves in harm's way. But we never really understood, like from a Western point of view, whenever I would see these images, I would think, but the world doesn't know who these people are, who these men are, who these boys are. Why don't we ever tell their stories? Why do we not know why they're willing to put themselves in harm's way? Why they're protesting? Why they're willing to face down Israeli soldiers? Why do we not know how their families ended up in these refugee camps to begin with? Most of the time, we didn't even know that the army was invading the refugee camp. So we had no context whatsoever for these images that we saw. But it always felt like in Western media, we were seeing images of Palestinians who looked violent and who were somehow, even though they're the ones with the guns pointed out at them, that they were somehow kind of provoking this. And so I really wanted to take that iconic image that I feel like the whole world has seen and tell the story of that kid and the family of that teenage, Palestinian teenage boy, how they ended up in the camp, how he ended up at that protest, why he's experiencing this moment of violence, and then how it changes the family. For me, that felt like the way into the story.
You are one of the stars of the film as well. Talk to me about making that decision of saying, okay, I feel like I need to be the one to really narrate and kind of guide this story through the mother.
It's funny because it's never an easy decision for me to make. And I think with this film, I took a lot of considerations. It's always like, the moment I start writing and I realize there's a role for myself, like the actor in me is like, pick me, pick me. And the director's like, hold on, don't, you have to kind of go through a process. And the director always wins, So it was really, I didn't really cast myself, even though I was thinking about it in the back of my mind, I didn't really cast myself until I felt comfortable, meaning that I needed to know that I could handle everything. I needed to know that I could direct and act in my second language, that I had a strong enough team around me of people who I really trusted who would have my back, that I would have enough time to watch playback. There were a number of factors that I had to make sure were really in place before I could make that decision. Of course, it helps that I'm not in every scene of the film. So that, that's a good, very good bonus. but I also, I think, needed to see myself in the part, you know? So once I really figured out what I would look like in the part and what kind of, what I shared in common with this character and what I felt like I could bring, that I thought like, okay, I do think I would be right for this. And then I, you know, and there were a lot of aspects of this character that I really wanted to explore within myself. And I found that I had a very distinct point of view of her. You know, she walks a bit of a tightrope in the film, tonally, you know, and I felt it was very sensitive. And it was really important to get it right, because in some ways she's the glue that's holding this story together. But I also, I think, you know, given that I'm the storyteller and she's the storyteller, sort of felt like there would be some fun parallels there.
I love seeing the switch too. I mean, it happens from a very sad moment between the father and son, but where we see the switch of her kind of being like, oh, I need to step in now. I need to be kind of the rock in the family while we mend this relationship between the two. And I thought that was so beautiful, even to see the way that you're visually mending so many people's hurts that are watching this film, that feel that hurt, that feel that generational trauma. And I thought that was just a great through line through it all. And I wanted to also ask you, how did you, kind of dealing with all of this, knowing that it's so personal, how did you emotionally protect yourself while going through all this, while fleeing to Jordan, while having to re-prep, while acting and making, you know, reliving a lot of these childhood moments through these characters?
You know, I think it's a really good question. And sometimes I look back and I think, I don't know. I don't know how I did that. You know, I think it was in the moment felt like survival, and it felt, in many moments, I really felt like my ancestors were looking out for me. There were so many kind of miracle moments where I thought the film's going to fall apart. And then something would happen at the very last second that would allow us to continue, you know, would allow us to continue shooting. I mean, from the time we started production on this film to the time we wrapped was 11 months. So a film that should have taken like 3 months took 11 months because of all of the different places we had to go, all of the additional prep we had to add in all of those places, and because we would have to stop shooting to raise more money. You know, we basically shot this film in a total financial crisis. All of that money we had spent in Palestine prepping was gone, and we had to continually raise more to keep going. We were also in a logistical crisis, trying to get our props out of Palestine, trying to get our crew out of Palestine. So it was really just such a challenge, but I just kept focusing on problem solving. And I think that one of the things that helps me keep going in moments like that is just knowing that I have privilege. And because of that privilege, I have a responsibility. And there's nothing more that I want to do with my life than to really step up to that responsibility. And to, like, this story was so important for me to tell that it was just, I felt like this is everything for me right now. Like, if it's the last thing I do, I've got to finish this film and get it out into the world and nurture it out into the world to make sure as many people see it as possible, just given the timing of it all and really what we've been seeing in the last 2 years. I mean, it's really the Palestinian people that kept me going and how inspiring they were. And I thought, you know, if they can survive what they've gone through, then I can definitely easily survive this.
How does it feel for you as a director, as a Palestinian American, to say, here you go, world, this is my most personal project, and I'm also standing firm in my beliefs, standing firm in making sure this gets seen, and also speaking openly about it as well?
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, you know, thank you for asking that, first of all. It's a really great question, and it's so beautiful to stand in your truth. I really think, like, for so many years, I think I was afraid to speak so openly about the Nakba. I think so many of us censored ourselves and felt that we, especially, you know, those of us living in the West, felt that we couldn't talk about it, that it, you know, in some places it still feels taboo to talk about it. And I think that has to end. I think that absolutely, you know, and I think on some level it has ended. In some circles it has ended. Certainly, even though we're paying an incredibly painful price, the world seems to be waking up to what the Palestinians have endured and continue to endure and go through. And so I think, you know, I'm just really grateful to be a part of that awakening and a part of that conversation and that process. And it just feels very empowering to be able to speak really openly and honestly about the lived experience of so many hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah. And my last question for you is noticing just the importance and the significance and symbolism of what home means, not necessarily just through land, but also through the physical home that the family loses and then finds again, but finds it in a completely different state. I'm so curious for you, what does home mean to you as a Palestinian American, and how do you define that?
Another very good question, I have to say. How do I define home? You know, for the longest time, I would say things like, you know, home is my family, or home is like the sound of my mother's voice on the telephone. You know, that home is such a personal thing. Like it's a feeling. It's a sense of belonging. It's, you know, and I think for me, having grown up in the diaspora, it's an even more complicated question, you know, that in some ways, home is Palestine, but certainly when I go there, I don't feel at home, you know, not under occupation and not, you know, but there are moments where I absolutely feel at home, where it's the one place in the world where when people hear my name, not only do they know exactly how to pronounce it, they know exactly the village my father is from. And I've never experienced that anywhere else in the world, you know, but that's not a place that I can live. I'm not allowed to go live there. So for me, home is, it's really my family. It's kind of like, you know, a place in my heart and a fleeting moment that I get in different places in the world, from, you know, Jordan to every now and then New York City where I live, to Palestine.